They say grief makes people do strange things, but in that fog-covered village, people whispered about one widow who went a little further. Every night, she stepped into the mist, barefoot, silent, and fed the crows pieces of her dreams. Nobody knew what she gave them or what the birds carried back. Some say she was sending messages to her dead husband. Others say she was feeding something much older, something that waits inside the fog.
The town of Ravens Hollow was no stranger to the biting chill of winter. Each year, as the first snowflakes began to settle on the slate rooftops and the skeletal branches of the ancient oaks, the townsfolk would brace themselves for the long months ahead. This year, however, there was a different kind of tension in the air. It clung to the icy breeze that swept through the narrow streets, a subtle unease that even the oldest residents could not explain. Elias Marrow stood at the edge of the main square, his breath forming small clouds that vanished quickly in the cold. Around him, the townspeople bustled about, their faces drawn tight against the wind as they sealed windows with thick cloth and stacked firewood in neat piles. The Gothic church, with its spires piercing the slate-grey sky like jagged teeth, loomed over the town, a silent sentinel watching the preparations. He pulled his coat tighter and glanced up at the church's bell tower, its silhouette stark against the fading light. The bells had rung regularly for centuries, marking their hours, calling the faithful to prayer. But tonight, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange feeling settled in Elias's chest, a restlessness that refused to be ignored. Back in his modest home, Elias sat before his battered oak desk, the soft glow of a candle flickering against the worn pages of his journal. The scent of old paper mingled with the faintest hint of smoke from the hearth. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes. He hesitated before dipping his pen into the inkwell, his mind replaying the strange rumors whispered throughout the day. "Did you hear it, Mrs. Calloway?" had asked in the market, her voice barely above a whisper. The bells they tolled early today, not with their usual chime, but like a scream. Elias frowned. He had dismissed it at first, imagining the old lady's frailty and the town's penchant for superstition. Yet, as he listened to the quiet settling outside, a faint echo tugged at his memory, a distant, piercing sound that seemed almost human. Later, as midnight approached, the town slipped into a hushed anticipation. Doors were bolted, shutters closed, and the streets emptied swiftly. Elias stepped outside once more, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The church stood dark and forbidding, its stained glass windows opaque in the moonlight. Then it began, the bells tolled, but it was no ordinary toll. Instead of the deep, sonorous chimes that reverberated through the valley, a chilling, wailing scream burst forth, raw, anguished, and unmistakably human. The sound twisted through the frozen air, clawing at the nerves of every soul still awake. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the scream hanging like a shadow over the town. Elias's heart pounded as he covered his ears, the sound scraping against his sanity. Around him, faint gasps and murmurs broke the silence. From the corner of his eye, he caught glimpses of neighbors peering from behind curtains, eyes wide with terror. "It's just the wind," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. Yet no one else seemed convinced. Mara Devlin, the local priestess, appeared at the door of her modest chapel, her face pale and eyes scanning the streets. Jonas Pike, the blacksmith, stood nearby, his broad frame tense, hands clenched into fists. "Elias," Mara called softly, "you heard it too. What does this mean?" He swallowed hard, the weight of his own doubts pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted, "but this isn't natural." Sheriff Alden emerged from a shadowed alley, his face grim. "I'll be checking around. No one's to leave their homes tonight." The church bells fell silent, leaving a ringing in the ears and a cold, oppressive void. Elias remained rooted to the spot, caught between the rational mind and a creeping dread that something ancient and terrible had awakened within Ravens Hollow. As the first night of the tolling passed, the townsfolk retreated into fearful silence. Whispers of curses and forgotten rituals spread like wildfire. Yet many dismissed Elias's growing concern, labeling him a worrywart or worse, a man haunted by old ghosts of his own making. But Elias knew better. The bells had spoken, and their scream was a warning, a herald of darkness yet to come. He retreated to his study once more, pen poised over the page. Tonight, he wrote, the bells cried out in agony, and with their scream, the shadow over Raven's Hollow deepens. Outside, the wind carried a faint echo of that scream, a sound that would haunt him long after the snow had melted and the church bells fell silent once again. The biting cold of Raven's Hollow seeped into every crevice, the snow blanketing the town in a muffled silence that felt both protective and oppressive. Elias Marrow sat at his small wooden desk beside the frosted windowpane, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the worn pages of his journal. Outside, the midnight bells tolled again, their sound piercing the stillness not with the familiar, comforting chime of a church bell, but with a harrowing, human-like scream that seemed to claw its way through the frozen air. Elias paused, his pen hovering over the paper, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling with the unnatural sound. He pressed his palm to the window, feeling the cold seep through the glass, and turned back to his notes. Midnight, second night. Bells toll with a scream, a voice, not a bell. Town restless, whispers of curses. He wrote quickly, the words tumbling out with an urgency born from a restless mind. The townsfolk had begun to murmur among themselves, their voices low and tense in the dim light of their hearths. Rumors spread like wildfire, dark omens, curses laid upon Raven's Hollow for sins long forgotten. Yet Elias, ever the skeptic, sought to ground these fears in reason, though even he could not deny the chilling effect the bells had. The following day, Elias met Mara Devlin in the shadowed nave of the Gothic church. Her tall figure was draped in austere clerical robes, her sharp eyes scanning the ancient carvings that lined the stone walls. The bells, she said softly, are crying out, but not for salvation. This is a warning, Elias. The sanctity of this place is at stake. We must pray, hold fast to faith, for it is our shield. Elias regarded her, the weight of her words settling uneasily in his chest. Mara's conviction was steadfast, but he felt the fissures in his own beliefs widening. Faith alone may not be enough, he murmured, if the darkness we face is beyond prayer. Outside, the snow fell steadily, cloaking the town in a ghostly white. That evening, Elias sought out Jonas Pike at the blacksmith's workshop, where the heat of the forge was a rare comfort against the encroaching chill. Jonas, broad-shouldered and soot-stained, wiped his hands on a rag, his brows furrowed. I can't explain these disappearances, Jonas admitted, but I don't believe in curses or spirits. There's got to be a reason, a rational one. But the first one's gone without a trace, no sign, no clue. Just gone. Elias nodded grimly, and it all started with the bells. Jonas' eyes darkened with concern, a rare crack in his pragmatic armor. If those bells are the key, we've got to find out why they're screaming. As night fell over Raven's Hollow once more, the eerie tolling echoed through the streets, its unnatural scream weaving through the skeletal branches of leafless trees. Footsteps crunched in the snow, only to abruptly stop near the church steps, a haunting silence following in their wake. The townsfolk huddled in their homes, windows shuttered against the unknown. Fear had taken root, spreading its tendrils through the community like frostbite. Elias sat again by his window, pen poised over the journal. The sound of the bells was no longer just a mystery. It was a harbinger. And with each toll, the town's fragile peace unraveled further. But Elias would not let the darkness claim Raven's Hollow without a fight. He would record every toll, every whisper, every shadow. For in the echoes of the bells he sensed a story waiting to be uncovered, one that might save them all, or doom them forever. As the clock neared midnight, the bells began their dread chorus anew, a scream that seemed to claw at the very soul of the town. Elias clenched his fists, steeling himself against the terror that threatened to consume them all. The night was far from over, and the echoes in the snow whispered of horrors yet to come. The dusk settled heavily over Raven's Hollow, the snow thickening with each passing hour, muffling the world into a brittle silence that felt almost unnatural. Elias Marrow stood on the town's main street, hands thrust deep into the pockets of his heavy coat, breath fogging in the frigid air. Around him, windows shuttered and doors bolted with hurried hands, the townsfolk retreating into the fragile safety of their homes. From the shadow of the Gothic church an eerie sound began to rise, first a low, slow tolling of bells, then beneath that, a faint, almost imperceptible human scream threaded through the chimes. Elias's heart clenched. He had heard the bells toll at midnight the night before, the sound like nothing he had ever known, twisted and raw, as though the bells themselves were crying out in pain. Now the sound wove through the streets again, chilling him to his core. Neighbors glanced nervously from curtained windows, their faces pale and drawn. Whispers of curses and dark omens floated through the frosty air, carried from door to door like smoke. Determined to understand, Elias headed toward the sheriff's office, the heavy crunch of snow beneath his boots the only sound accompanying his thoughts. Sheriff Alden sat behind his cluttered desk, the room dim and smelling faintly of tobacco and old leather. His face, weathered by years of winter and worry, was set in a skeptical frown as Elias explained the strange tolling and the disappearances. "Elias, you're a good man, but sometimes I think you let your mind wander too far," Alden said, voice low but firm. "People go missing for all kinds of reasons. This town has its share of troubles, but ghosts and curses, that's not something I can chase after." Elias's jaw tightened. "But the disappearances only happen on the nights the bells toll. There's a connection. You have to see it." Alden shook his head, the weight of his duty pressing down. "I'll keep looking, but we need proof, not just fear." Frustrated but undeterred, Elias left the office and made his way to the parish hall, where Mara Devlin awaited. The priestess exuded a quiet strength, her tall figure wrapped in austere clerical robes. Her eyes, sharp and penetrating, seemed to see through the growing veil of fear enveloping the town. "The bells," Mara said without preamble as Elias entered, "they are no longer just a call to prayer. They have become a weapon. The church's past is darker than most know. There are ancient rites, forgotten and forbidden, tied to those bells." Elias frowned, the skeptic in him wrestling with the dread growing in his chest. "A weapon? Against whom?" "Against the soul of this town," Mara whispered. "Sound can carry more than words. It can carry fear, despair, even death." Her words echoed in the cold chamber as the flickering candlelight danced on the stained glass windows, casting shifting shadows that seemed to lean closer, listening. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. As night deepened, a search party gathered near the edge of the woods, torches sputtering in the cold wind. Elias stood among them, anxiety knotting his stomach. The bells tolled again, louder, more tortured, as if mourning the lost souls swallowed by the darkness. Snow crunched underfoot, absorbing the sounds into a suffocating stillness immediately after each toll. The vanished were becoming too many to ignore. Whispers of curses grew louder, suspicion fractured the community, and a suffocating fear took root. Elias's mind raced. If sound was the weapon, if the bells were the source, then how could he fight a force that struck unseen and unheard by all but the victims? His journal, which he had begun to keep since the first strange toll, felt heavier in his coat pocket. Each entry a testament to the unraveling of the town and his own fraying certainty. That night, as Elias lay awake, the bells tolled once more. The scream beneath the ringing was unmistakable, now a human cry twisted into a terrible lament that clawed at his soul. He closed his eyes, willing himself to believe that dawn would bring answers, or at least respite. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the towering oaks that framed the ancient path to Old Man Griggs's home. Elias Marrow pulled his coat tighter around his lean frame, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The snow had begun to settle quietly on the ground, blanketing Raven's Hollow in an almost unnatural silence, broken only by the faint, distant tolling of the church bells, an eerie sound that now haunted every corner of the town. He paused before the weather-beaten door of Griggs's cottage, its paint peeling and windows frosted over, and knocked hesitantly. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing the stooped figure of the town's historian. Griggs's pale eyes, sharp despite his age, flickered with recognition. "Alias," he greeted softly, his voice raspy yet steady. "Come in before the cold steals the warmth from your bones." The interior was a cramped sanctuary of history, with shelves groaning under the weight of dusty tomes, brittle manuscripts, and relics from ages past. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls cluttered with faded maps and sepia-toned photographs. Elias removed his gloves, the chill lingering in his fingers, and sat across from Griggs at a rickety wooden table. "I came because I need to understand," Elias began, his voice low. "The bells, they are not just ringing. There's something wrong." Griggs nodded slowly, pulling a fragile book from a nearby shelf. Its leather cover was cracked, the spine worn thin from countless readings. "You were right to be concerned. The church bells have long been more than mere instruments of timekeeping in Raven's Hollow." He opened the book carefully, revealing hand-drawn illustrations of the Gothic church as it stood centuries ago. Among the sketches were depictions of a towering bell tower, its great bronze bells entwined with thick ropes, but interwoven with ghostly faces and shadowy forms that seemed to writhe within the metal's surface. "There was once a guardian spirit," Griggs explained, tapping on a particularly eerie illustration. "Bound to the bells, it was meant to protect the town, a sentinel of faith and safety. But centuries ago, during a ritual intended to renew this bond, something went terribly wrong." Elias leaned forward, the firelight catching the troubled lines on his face. "What happened? Human cruelty and fear corrupted the spirit," Griggs said quietly. "The ritual was botched, some say out of desperation, others out of malice. The Guardian twisted into what we now call the Bell Wraith. A malevolent entity feeding on faith turned to fear, using the bells not to protect but to torment." A distant tolling rose through the window, warped and distorted, echoing through the cold air like a scream trapped in bronze. Elias's heart clenched, a cold sweat breaking across his brow. "It's real," he whispered more to himself than to Griggs. "The Bell Wraith." Griggs closed the book with a slow finality. "The past does not rest easy here, Elias. You must be prepared for what you might face." Elias stood, the weight of the knowledge pressing heavily against his chest. Outside, the twilight deepened, and the church's silhouette loomed like a dark sentinel over the snow-covered town. The wind carried the faint, dreadful sound of the bells once more, their sinister tolling threading through the stillness. As he walked away from Griggs's cottage, Elias felt the first true fissure in his skepticism. The stories, once dismissed as folklore, now echoed in the very air around him, wrapped in the cold bite of winter and the whisper of something ancient and terrible stirring within the bell tower. He knew the path ahead was dark and uncertain, but the truth was calling him into the shadows where faith and fear entwined in deadly harmony. And the bells would not stop tolling until the nightmare was faced head-on. The night deepened, and with it, the weight of the past pressed ever closer, whispering ancient secrets into the freezing wind. The cold wind sliced through the narrow streets of Raven's Hollow as night fell like a shroud over the snow-blanketed town. The Gothic church, with its towering spires and dark stone walls, cast long shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers across the desolate square. Inside the sanctuary, the great bells hung heavy and silent until the stroke of midnight shattered the stillness with a scream unlike any other. Elias Marrow stood at the edge of his porch, breath clouding the freezing air as the bells began their mournful toll. But this was no ordinary chime. The sound twisted and warped, a harsh, human-like shriek that clawed at the edges of sanity. The cry echoed through the empty streets, reverberating off the snow-covered rooftops and settling deep into the bones of the town. He felt it then a tremor beneath his skin, as if the sound reached inside him to stir something long buried. His heart pounded in his chest, yet he dared not move. Around him, the windows flickered with candlelight, faces pressed to glass, eyes wide with growing terror. The town was holding its breath, caught between disbelief and dread. Inside his study, Elias closed the door and leaned against it, hands trembling. The journal lay open on the desk, pages filled with his meticulous notes and sketches of the bell tower. Yet now, those notes seemed inadequate against the rising tide of fear. He rubbed his temples, trying to will away the pounding in his head. The screams from the bells seemed to echo endlessly in his mind, weaving together with memories he had tried to suppress. Visions burst forth unbidden, his sister Clara, pale and fragile, her eyes wide with terror as the ritual spiraled out of control years ago. The frantic prayers, the sudden silence, then her vanishing like a shadow swallowed by darkness. The sound of the bells had been different then, but now it was the same twisted scream, a voice that carried pain and rage. Elias staggered back from the desk, clutching at the air as the room spun. The line between past and present blurred, and for a moment he was back in the church crypt, surrounded by shadows that whispered his name. The scream grew louder, sharper, as if the bells themselves sought to unmake him. A sharp knock at the door jolted him. "Elias, are you well?" The voice was calm but firm, Mara Devlin's. He opened the door to find her framed by the dim hallway light, eyes sharp and unwavering. "You are not well," she said, stepping inside. "The bells there growing stronger, more vicious. You must stop doubting. This is not mere superstition or madness. Something dark is at work, and it feeds on our fear." Elias shook his head, frustration boiling beneath his skin. "I don't deny the terror, Mara. But this might be something else. A trick of the mind, perhaps. We cannot simply surrender to shadows." Her eyes narrowed. "Faith is not surrender, Elias. It is the weapon we have. Without it we are defenseless. You must understand what is happening before it consumes us all." He looked away, the weight of her words pressing down. The battle within himself was as fierce as the one outside, his skepticism clashing with the desperate hope Mara embodied. Meanwhile, beyond the church's reach, Jonas pike-wiped soot from his hands as he stepped out of his forge. The snow had thickened, muffling his footsteps as he moved toward the town square. Whispers drifted on the cold wind, accusations, fear, and suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another with distrust, their bonds fraying under the strain of the unexplained vanishings. Jonas's gaze hardened as he scanned the shadowed windows and shuttered doors. "We can't let fear tear us apart," he muttered to himself. He knew Elias was struggling, that the schoolteacher's doubts mirrored the town's fragile state. But rationality alone would not save them. Back inside the church, Mara stood before the altar, her hands folded tightly as she prayed for strength. The ancient stones seemed to hum with a dark energy that seeped into her bones. She had seen the signs, the fractures in the town's faith, the desperate clinging to reason in the face of the impossible. The bells were no longer just an ominous sound. They had become a weapon, wielded by a force that thrived on despair. Her thoughts returned to Elias. He was their best hope, yet his inner turmoil threatened to unravel everything. She resolved to confront him again, to break through his walls of doubt before it was too late. When she found him again, Elias was pacing near the churchyard, eyes haunted and distant. The snow fell softly around them, muffling the sounds of the restless town. "Elias," Mara began, "you must trust that this is real. The bell wraith uses our fear to grow stronger. Doubting only gives it power." He stopped, meeting her gaze with a mixture of pain and resolve. "And if I cannot believe, what then? Am I doomed to watch it destroy everything I care about?" "Faith," she said quietly, "is forged in the darkest moments. It is not blind, but brave. You must find that bravery within yourself." The bells tolled again, their screams slicing through the night like a blade. This time, the sound seemed to pierce Elias's very soul, stirring a storm of emotions: fear, anger, sorrow, and a flicker of something else, hope. As the night deepened, The town's fragile unity strained under the weight of suspicion. Doors were bolted tight, whispers of curses and betrayal grew louder, and the once close-knit community began to fracture. The sound of the bells was no longer just a signal, it was a weapon, turning neighbor against neighbor, doubt against faith. Elias stood alone beneath the looming church, the shadows of the bell tower falling across his face. The scream echoed once more, a twisted symphony of anguish and despair. He clenched his fists and whispered to the night, "I will find the truth, no matter the cost." But the question lingered in the cold air. Could he overcome his doubt before the darkness consumed them all? The night held its breath, waiting for an answer that only the tolling bells could decide. The day had waned into a grey dusk when Elias Marrow found himself standing at the heavy oak doors of the Gothic church, their iron hinges groaning softly against the cold wind. Beside him, Jonas Pike adjusted the lantern, the flickering flame casting a warm glow against the stone, struggling against the gathering shadows. "You sure about this, Elias?" Jonas asked, his voice low but steady, eyes scanning the intricate carvings that adorned the church's weathered facade. Elias nodded, though his heart pounded with a mixture of resolve and trepidation. "We have no choice. The disappearances, the bell tolling, it's all connected. Somewhere beneath this place lies the answer." The two men pushed open the doors into the church's cavernous interior. The faint scent of aged wood, incense, and something more sinister clung to the air. Rows of empty pews stretched into the darkness, the stained glass windows casting fractured hues onto the cold stone floor. Elias's footsteps echoed as they made their way toward the crypt entrance concealed beneath the altar. Jonas hesitated, then crouched to lift the heavy stone slab covering the crypt stairs. A rush of icy air surged upward, chilling their faces as they descended into the subterranean depths. The crypt was a labyrinth of stone corridors and chambers, walls etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the lantern's glow. Elias traced a finger along the faded carvings, twisted figures entwined with bell motifs, ancient script curling like smoke. "These symbols, they speak of rituals," Elias murmured, voice barely above the whispering air. Jonas's gaze flicked nervously around the chamber. "Rituals? You mean like the ones they used to say went wrong?" "Yes," Elias said, swallowing the lump in his throat. Old man Griggs mentioned something about a guardian spirit corrupted by human hands, bound within these walls. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on Elias, stirring memories of his sister Clara's death, her life extinguished in a ritual gone awry, faith twisted into darkness. He shivered, though the crypt's chill was a physical thing. Outside, the town's unease was palpable. Snow lay thick, muffling footsteps, but not the spreading whispers. In the town square, a gathering of anxious faces exchanged furtive glances and pointed fingers. Fear had begun to fracture what little unity the community had left. Mara Devlin stood at the center, her austere figure a beacon of calm amid the storm of suspicion. "We must not let fear consume us," she urged, voice firm and resolute. "The church is our sanctuary. Prayer and faith will light the way through this darkness." Yet even as she spoke, Elias knew the fractures ran deep. Accusations of betrayal and secret pacts floated through the cold air like biting wind. The disappearances had sown seeds of distrust, and in their place grew a garden of paranoia. Back beneath the church, Elias and Jonas continued their grim exploration. Elias's fingers brushed against a weathered tome, its pages brittle, but inscribed with indecipherable script and disturbing illustrations. Images of bells ringing with faces screaming within their bronze surfaces. "This is it," Elias whispered, unease thickening his voice. "The sound, it's no accident. It's a weapon, a curse bound to this place." Jonas's jaw tightened. "We need to tell Mara." But before they could leave, a sudden, sharp toll echoed through the crypt, penetrating the thick stone as if the bell itself was ringing beneath them. Elias stumbled, clutching the rough wall as a wave of nausea and dread swept over him. The sound twisted into a scream, piercing, human, agonized. In that moment, memories of Clara's terrified eyes flooded back, his faith, already fragile, trembled on the edge of collapse. Why me? He thought desperately. Why her? Why now? Jonas steadied him, voice firm. You're not alone, Elias. We'll get through this. Elias nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at his soul. The crypt's secrets had deepened the mystery, but also the darkness that threatened to consume Raven's Hollow. The battle between faith and fear was only beginning. As they ascended back into the bitter night, the wind carried the faint tolling of the bells, a mournful reminder that the town's nightmare was far from over. Elias paused at the church steps, gaze fixed on the shadowed bell tower. Somewhere within, the source of the evil waited, feeding on the town's fractured faith and growing despair. His own doubts and fears were weapons the Bellwraith wielded with merciless precision. Yet beneath the weight of uncertainty, a stubborn ember of resolve burned. He would confront the darkness, no matter what it demanded. For the town, for Clara, for the fragile hope that might yet survive the coming storm. The bells tolled again, sharper and louder, calling the night into deeper shadow. Elias stepped forward, the cold biting into his skin, but his heart steeled against the rising tide of fear. The crypt's secrets were a key, but the lock was still unbroken, and the town waited, breath held, for what the next midnight would bring. The heavy snow blanketed Raven's Hollow in a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant tolling of the ancient church bells. But tonight, the familiar clang was warped into something far more sinister, a scream, raw and human, wrenching itself from the depths of the bell tower and slicing through the frozen night air. The sound seemed alive, a living thing that clawed at the edges of sanity. Elias Marrow sat alone by the window of his study, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the worn pages of his journal. His breath fogged the glass as the bells began their mournful chorus. At first, the tolling was faint, distant, but then it sharpened, twisting into an ear-splitting scream that clawed its way into his mind. His fingers clenched the edge of the desk, knuckles white. No. Not again, he whispered, pressing his palms to his temples as the ringing invaded every corner of his consciousness. The room spun, and for a moment, he felt as though he were drowning in sound waves of agony and despair crashing over him, each toll a blade. A shadow flickered at the doorway. Mara Devlin entered silently, her austere presence a stark contrast to the chaos inside Elias's mind. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, met his in the dim light. "You must hold fast," she said, her voice steady but edged with worry. "The Bellwraith grows stronger. Its voice is no longer a distant echo. It reaches into the soul, twisting faith into fear." Elias nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "It's targeting me," he admitted, voice strained. I can barely think." Mara crossed the room with purposeful strides, producing a small vial of holy water and a bundle of sage. The air thickened with the scent of burning herbs as she began to chant in a low, rhythmic cadence. The flickering candle flames danced wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to reach for Elias. Outside, the town was unraveling. The sudden, violent scream of the bells shattered the fragile calm, sending the townsfolk into a frenzy. Windows slammed shut. Doors were bolted against unseen threats. Jonas Pike worked feverishly in the blacksmith shop, the steady ring of his hammer on iron a defiant counterpoint to the church's malevolent tolling. "We can't just wait for it to come for us," Jonas muttered, sweat mingling with soot on his brow. "If it's using the sound to hunt, we need to block it." His neighbors gathered, faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Murmurs of curses and dark omens spread like wildfire. The fear was palpable, contagious, feeding the Bellwraith's power in ways no one fully understood. Back in the church, Mara's voice rose, weaving ancient prayers into the cold air. Elias struggled to focus, the scream hammering against his thoughts, but he forced himself to stand. The protective circle she traced with salt and sage offered a fragile barrier, a temporary reprieve from the onslaught. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from the bell tower, as if the very ropes were straining under an unseen weight. The bells tolled again, louder, more frenzied. Faces appeared briefly in the bell's bronze surface twisted, screaming mouths frozen in eternal torment. Elias staggered, clutching the stone altar for support. The air around him vibrated with the cursed sound, a physical force that pressed into his chest and throat. Visions flickered at the edges of his sight, shadowy figures reaching out, whispers of lost souls begging for release, memories of Clara's death flooding his mind. "Hold on," Mara's voice cut through the cars.
"You are stronger than this!"
Jonas burst through the church doors, breath ragged, eyes wild.
"They're coming!"
The sounds driving people mad.
"We have to get everyone inside, now!"
The protective wards were weakening. The Bellwraith's power surged with every scream. The townsfolk's hysteria threatened to consume them, turning neighbor against neighbor in suspicion and fear. Elias forced his trembling legs to move, stepping toward the tower stairs. "I have to stop it," he said, voice barely audible over the wailing bells. Mara placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You are not alone. But be careful, the Bellwraith knows your fears. It will use them against you." As the bells screamed once more, the line between sound and violence blurred, the weaponized tolling a relentless assault on mind and spirit. Elias's resolve hardened, knowing the battle to save Raven's Hollow had only just begun and the scream of the bells would not be silenced without a fight. The night stretched on, heavy with dread and the echo of tortured cries, as Elias stepped into the shadowed heart of the church. The scream of the bells ringing in his ears and in his soul. The bitter wind swept across Raven's Hollow, carrying with it the faint, yet unmistakable wail of the church bells. It was past midnight, yet the bells tolled on their own accord, the sound not of metal striking metal, but of anguished voices, human screams twisted into grotesque echoes that clawed at the edges of sanity. Elias' marrow pulled his coat tighter around his lean frame, his breath visible in the frosty air, as he made his way toward the modest home of Mara Divlin. The town was wrapped in a silence heavy with fear, every shadow seeming to twitch with malevolence. Inside Mara's parlor the room was dim, alive only with the flickering dance of candle flames. The scent of burning beeswax mingled with the faint odor of old wood and leather-bound books lining the shelves. Mara sat upright in her chair, her austere clerical robes folding crisply around her tall figure. Her sharp eyes, illuminated by the candlelight, locked onto Elias with a gravity that sent a shiver down his spine. "You must call it by its true name," Mara said quietly, the weight of her words settling like a stone. "The Bellwraith." Elias felt the name echo in his mind, as if the very syllables carried a dark power. "Bellwraith, what is it?" Mara's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "Long ago it was a guardian spirit bound to protect this town and its people. But centuries of neglect, cruelty, and dark rituals have twisted it into something far more sinister. It feeds on fear, despair, and fractured faith. It has become a weapon forged from sound itself, a predator lurking within the bell tower." Elias swallowed hard, the room suddenly feeling colder despite the fire in the hearth. "So the bells, they were not just ringing, they're hunting." Mara nodded solemnly. "Each toll is a summons, a call that ensnares those who hear it. The Bellwraith uses their fear as fuel, growing stronger with every scream it harvests." The revelation gnawed at Elias's skepticism, the logical part of his mind grappling with the supernatural weight of Mara's tale. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The disappearances, the unsettling sounds, the pervasive terror gripping Raven's Hollow, it all pointed to a darkness far beyond mere superstition. Later that night, Elias stood outside the church, the Gothic spires piercing the starless sky. The cold bit at his cheeks as the bells began their mournful tolling once more. But this time he listened closely, hearing the faint undertone of agony beneath the clangor, a chorus of ghostly faces crying out in torment. His heart pounded as shadows writhed within the bell tower, faces flickering briefly in the bronze surfaces, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Determined not to succumb to despair, Elias sought out Jonas Pike the next morning, finding the blacksmith at work in his forge. The rhythmic clang of hammer against anvil rang out, a stark contrast to the sinister silence that had settled over the rest of the town. "Jonas," Elias began, wiping soot from his hands, "I've learned what we're dealing with. It's called the Bell Wraith. A corrupted spirit bound to the bells, feeding on our fear. We can't just hide, we have to fight." Jonas paused, his rugged face shadowed by concern. "I don't like this talk of spirits and curses, Elias. But if what you say is true, then we'll need more than faith. We'll need fire, steel, and a plan." Their conversation was low, urgent, two men forging an alliance forged not just in friendship, but in necessity. Mara's warnings echoed in Elias's mind. Faith alone might not be enough, but without it, the Bellwraith's grip would only tighten. As night fell once more, Elias stood beneath the looming bell tower, the air thick with the frozen breath of winter. The ropes swayed without wind, casting long, sinuous shadows that seemed to reach for him. Faces appeared and vanished within the bronze bells, anguished, screaming hopeless. The Bellwraith watched, waiting for the next soul to seize. Elias clenched his fists, the chill in his bones matched by a burning resolve. He would confront the darkness, armed with knowledge, allies, and a flicker of faith rekindled by desperate hope. The night was far from over, and the battle for Raven's Hollow had only just begun. But as the bells tolled once more, deeper and more menacing than before, Elias knew one thing for certain. The Bellwraith's grip was tightening, and soon. The town would have to face its shadow or be swallowed whole. The cold wind howled through the skeletal branches of the ancient trees, carrying the Bellwraith's mournful cry into the heart of Raven's Hollow. And somewhere, deep within the bell tower, the entity waited, patient, hungry, and growing ever stronger. The heavy wooden door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty church hall, its sound swallowed by the vast, shadowed space within Raven's Hollow's Gothic sanctuary. Elias' marrow paused, breath visible in the biting cold that seeped from the crypt below the bell tower. His lantern cast a trembling circle of light on the ancient stone steps that spiraled downward into darkness. The air grew colder with each descent, thick with the scent of damp earth mold, and something far older, something that whispered of long-forgotten pain and shadowed secrets. As Elias reached the bottom step, the first distant toll of the bells vibrated through the stone walls, a mournful, chilling sound that seemed to carry a human scream within its metallic cry. It was a sound he had heard too many times in recent nights, one that gnawed at the edges of his reason and stirred the ghosts of his past. Clutching his lantern tightly, he advanced into the crypt, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare dust that carpeted the uneven floor. The crypt was a narrow chamber, its walls lined with crumbling niches and faded carvings, symbols of faith now twisted by time into something almost alien. Elias' light flickered over the etchings, ancient prayers and warnings scrawled in Latin, worn almost illegible. Above him, the bell ropes hung like thick, dark veins, pulsating faintly as if alive, their movements slow and unnatural. From the bronze bells suspended above, ghostly faces emerged and vanished, a writhing tableau of torment and despair. Their silent screams pressed against Elias's ears, a soundless cacophony that threatened to unravel his sanity. His heart pounded as shadows danced around him, shapes shifting just beyond the lantern's glow. Suddenly, the air seemed to thicken, and the spectral presence of the Bellwraith made itself known. The entity was no mere shadow but a living manifestation of corrupted faith and despair, its form interlaced with the bell's bronze surface, faces contorted in eternal agony. It reached toward Elias, tendrils of darkness weaving through the ropes, seeking to ensnare him in its malevolent grasp. A sudden wave of memories crashed over Elias, blurring the lines between present and past. The crypt seemed to pulse with the echoes of his sister Clara's final moments, a twisted replay of that terrible night when faith had shattered and darkness had claimed her. He saw her pale face, eyes wide with terror, her scream mingling with the bell's dreadful toll. The vision was so vivid, so painful that Elias staggered, clutching his chest as if to hold his heart in place. Yet beneath the torment, a fragile thread of defiance stirred within him. From his pocket, Elias drew the worn locket Clara had given him years ago, its surface cold but comforting in his palm. Whispering a prayer, hesitant but resolute, he faced the Bellwraith's looming presence. The entity recoiled slightly, disturbed by the strength of his will, but it was far from defeated. The crypt seemed to close in around him as a spectral wind howled through the chamber, the bells tolling with renewed fury. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps. His mind battled the storm of fear, grief and doubt, but he forced himself to stand firm. The Bellwraith sought to consume his spirit, to crack the fragile foundation of his belief, and drag him into despair. But Elias, haunted though he was, had found a new core of courage. He would not let the past claim him again. With every toll of the bell, he whispered another prayer, each word a small defiance against the darkness. The crypt's oppressive atmosphere began to shift. The ghostly faces in the bronze bells faded, their screams growing distant. Elias's lantern steadied, casting a steady light that pushed back the shadows. He knew this was only the beginning of his battle, but for the first time he felt the spark of hope. As he ascended the stone steps back to the church's main chamber, the toll of the bells softened, retreating into silence. The night outside awaited, colder and darker than ever, but Elias Marrow was no longer a man broken by doubt. He was a man prepared to face the darkness beneath the bells, and whatever else it might throw at him. The silence that followed the final bell toll was not peace. It was a challenge, and Elias was ready to answer it. The church's bell tower loomed overhead, silhouetted against a bleak, starless sky. The cold wind sifted snowflakes through the heavy air, carrying with it the faintest echo of a scream that no living voice could make. The air in the crypt was thick with a chilling resonance, an oppressive force that seemed to bend the very fabric of sound itself. Elias Marrow stood alone beneath the towering bell tower, the ancient stones around him vibrating with a primal intensity. The bells above tolled relentlessly, but these were no ordinary chimes, they were screams, twisted and warped into a cacophony that clawed at the edges of his sanity. He gripped the cold iron railing of the spiral staircase leading deeper into the crypt, the metal biting into his palms. Each step echoed in the hollow chamber like a heartbeat, a reminder of his fragile mortality. The deeper he descended, the louder the Bellwraith's cries became, a relentless symphony of anguish and fury that seemed to seep from the very bronze of the bells themselves. Elias's breath fogged the frigid air as he reached the crypt's heart, a cavernous room where the bell ropes hung like strangling serpents from the ceiling. The Bellwraith manifested there, a shifting shadow entwined with the ropes and bells, its form flickering, with ghostly faces locked in eternal screams. Its voice was 1,000 tortured souls wailing in unison, a sound that assaulted every sense and sought to tear down his will. "You cannot resist," the Bellwraith hissed, its voice slithering into Elias's mind. "Faith is folly. Hope is a lie. You will fall as they did." Elias staggered, clutching his head as the sound waves hammered him from all directions. The entity weaponized the ringing, turning it into a barrage of sonic shards that cut through his resolve. His vision blurred, the walls melting into a whirl of shadows and screams. Then, piercing through the chaos, he heard it, a faint, clear tone, a single bell note, pure and unwavering. Above ground, Mara Divlin and Jonas Pike stood at the crypt's entrance, their voices rising in a steady chant. Mara's words, ancient and solemn, wove through the cold night air, a spiritual shield against the Bellwraith's assault. Jonas's steady presence grounded her, his hands clutching a talisman forged from iron and faith. Back in the crypt, Elias focused on that clear note, letting it anchor him. The hallucinations swirled visions of Clara, her face pale and terrified, the moment of her death replaying endlessly. The Bellwraith twisted her screams, mocking his pain. Yet, Elias's grip tightened on his journal, the worn leather a tangible link to his purpose. "You feed on my fear," Elias whispered, voice trembling but resolute. "But I will not be broken." The bell-wraith's form writhed, the faces within the bells contorting with rage. The sonic onslaught intensified, but Elias summoned every ounce of his will. Sound, he realized, was not only a weapon of destruction. It could be wielded as a force of hope, a beacon in the darkest night. He began to chant softly, words of ancient rites learned from Mara and Old Man Griggs, weaving them into the very air. The bells' screams faltered, wavering like a storm losing strength. Above, Mara's chant rose, a chorus of defiance that intertwined with Elias's voice, creating a counterpoint to the terror. Sweat dripped down Elias's brow as the bell-wraith screamed in fury, the crypt shaking with its rage. Yet the sound shifted, a melody of resistance blossomed amid the chaos. Elias stepped forward, each word spoken, carving a path through the darkness. "By faith and by sound I bind you," he declared, voice steadying. "No longer shall you feast on despair." The bell-wraith's form fragmented, the ghostly faces dissolving into silence. The bells above ceased their dreadful tolling, replaced by a ringing stillness that settled like snow over the town. Elias collapsed to his knees, breath ragged but triumphant. He had faced the weaponized sound and emerged not broken, but forged anew. The struggle was far from over, but for the first time, hope had found a voice amidst the screams. Outside, Mara and Jonas exhaled in relief, their chants trailing into the cold night. The battle beneath the bell tower was only the beginning, but a fragile peace had been won. Elias's gaze lifted toward the silent bells overhead, their bronze surfaces gleaming faintly in the moonlight. In their stillness lay a promise, a warning, and the hope that, even in the darkest of nights, sound could be wielded not as a weapon of fear, but as a shield of faith. And somewhere deep within the silence, a new toll awaited, one that might yet bring salvation or doom. The night was far from over, and Elias knew the true test was yet to come. The air in the church's crypt was thick with an almost tangible tension, pressing in on Elias' marrow from all sides. The cold stone walls seemed to drink in the flickering light of the lone candle he held, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Around him, the ghostly faces embedded in the bell's bronze surface twisted in silent screams, their hollow eyes fixed on him with malevolent hunger. The bell-wraith's presence was suffocating, a crushing force that sought to break him both mentally and spiritually. Elias took a deep breath, steadying his trembling hands. The words Mara had taught him echoed in his mind, an ancient incantation, fragile yet potent, whispered down through generations of forgotten faith and hope. He closed his eyes briefly, summoning every ounce of willpower to speak the words aloud. His voice was low at first, barely more than a murmur, but it grew stronger as the chant wound through the air, weaving a fragile barrier against the darkness. Sanctum vocis, lumen fide, he intoned, the Latin syllables rolling off his tongue with practiced care. The ancient rite was meant to sanctify the sacred space and repel evil, but here below the bell tower, surrounded by twisted remnants of corrupted faith, its power felt tenuous, as if the very walls conspired against him. Above, the distant echo of the bells told a sound warped into a cacophony of human screams that reverberated through the town like a monstrous symphony. Elias's heart clenched, the memories of vanished friends and neighbors flashing before his eyes. He could feel the bell-wraith pressing against his thoughts, trying to unravel the fragile threads of his resolve. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the air, and Elias opened his eyes to see Mara standing at the threshold of the crypt's entrance. Her presence was a steady beacon amid the chaos. Clad in her austere clerical robes, she held tightly to an ancient prayer book, her voice rising in a steady cadence that cut through the mounting terror. "By the light of the sacred flame, we bind thee, spirit of despair. Begone from this place." Her words lent strength to Elias, bolstering the fragile shield his incantation had begun to form. He felt a flicker of hope, a small flame of defiance against the encroaching darkness. But the bell-wraith was relentless. The bells tolled again, louder now, their screams searing into his mind like a physical blow. Elias staggered, clutching the stone wall for support as visions of his sister Clara's death flashed vividly before him, her pale face twisted in pain. The cruel ritual that had shattered his faith. "No," he whispered fiercely, shaking his head to dispel the torment. "Not now. Not here." From the shadows near the altar, old man Griggs appeared, his frail frame hunched over a bundle of brittle, yellowed pages. The candlelight flickered across his lined face, etched deep with worry and determination. "Elias," he rasped, voice cracking with age, "there's a passage here, an ancient ritual to sever the link between the spirit and the bells. It's dangerous, but it may be our only chance." Elias nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Together they hurried through the text, Mara's steady voice chanting protective prayers while Elias prepared himself for the final confrontation. The air grew colder still, the Bellwraith's presence swelling like a storm about to break. As Elias readied the ritual, the sound of the bells swelled into a deafening roar. The ghostly faces in the bronze shifted violently, their screams twisting into a nightmarish chorus that clawed at his sanity. Yet, despite the onslaught, Elias stood firm, voice rising in defiant chant, weaving the ancient words of power through the darkness. The crypt trembled, dust falling like snow from the ceiling as the Bellwraith shrieked in fury, its form flickering like a shadow caught in a storm. Elias felt the tide begin to turn, the oppressive weight of despair lifting, replaced by a fragile, shimmering light. The bells above began to toll more slowly, their screams fading into mournful tolls that spoke of release rather than terror. Exhausted but unyielding, Elias lowered the prayer book, the last words of the ritual hanging heavy in the cold air. For a moment, silence reigned, a silence so profound it seemed to echo with the breath of the town itself. But the battle was far from over. Elias knew this victory was but a pause, a fragile reprieve in a war that had only just begun. Yet, in that shattered silence, a seed of hope took root. The Bellwraith had been challenged, its hold weakened, and the town of Raven's Hollow had been given a chance to breathe once more. Elias's eyes met Mara's, her gaze steady and unwavering, and old man Griggs's wary smile. Together, they faced the uncertain dawn, bound by a shared resolve to protect their home from the darkness still lurking just beyond the edge of the fading night. And as the first light of morning seeped through the stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the cold stone floor, Elias felt a spark within him, a rekindled faith, forged not in certainty, but in the courage to face fear itself. Yet, the bells had not fully silenced. Their echoes lingered, a haunting reminder that the struggle was far from over. And somewhere, deep within the shadowed bell tower, the Bellwraith waited, patient and hungry, ready to strike again. The night was broken, but the silence was shattered too. And in that fracture lay both danger and the promise of redemption. The crypt beneath the bell tower was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and ancient dust. Elias Marrow's breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale forming a fleeting mist that curled and vanished into the gloom. His fingers, numb from the biting cold and the strain of the ritual, traced the faded symbols, etched into the floor a language older than the town itself, a language of faith and desperation. The bells above him, which had for weeks cast their sinister screams into the night, pulsed with a final, agonizing toll, a sound that seemed to shred the very fabric of the air. Elias's heart thundered in his chest as he whispered the last incantation, the words catching in his throat like a fragile thread. The oppressive ringing faltered, then faltered again, until at last it ceased entirely. Silence enveloped the crypt, profound and unsettling. For a moment Elias feared the stillness was a trick, a breath held before the storm returned. But instead, as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the stained glass windows high above, a fragile peace settled over Raven's Hollow. He stumbled to his feet, legs weak but spirit momentarily lifted. Outside, the town was awakening from a nightmare. At the edge of the square, Figures began to emerge from the shadows, those who had vanished during the nights of terror. Their eyes were wide, haunted by memories too painful to voice. Some clung to one another, trembling hands seeking comfort in the icy air. They were alive, but changed, as if the Belwraith's grasp had left unseen scars. Mara Divlin was already tending to a pale woman whose lips quivered with silent prayers. Jonas Pike moved among the crowd, his rugged hands steady as he helped guide a frightened child. Their faces, etched with exhaustion and relief, mirrored Elias's own conflicted emotions. The town, though battered, was beginning to breathe again. Elias found a quiet corner near the church's ancient altar, his journal clutched tightly in his hands. He opened it, fingers tracing the hastily scrawled notes and sketches of the bell's cursed song. For weeks he had doubted, wrestled with the fracture between his skepticism and the undeniable horror he had witnessed. Now, with the bells silenced and the missing returned, something within him shifted. He thought of Clara, her ghostly presence lingering in the shadows of his mind, and how this ordeal had forced him to confront the deepest corners of his faith and fear. The battle was far from over. The Belwraith's shadow still loomed, a threat that might return with the next toll of the bells. But for the first time, Elias felt a flicker of hope, a fragile light breaking through the darkness. Outside, the snow glistened under the morning sun, each flake a silent witness to the night's horrors and the dawn's promise. The bells, once instruments of terror, now lay still, their silence a tentative truce in the war for Raven's Hollow. As Elias closed his journal, the distant church remained quiet, but within him, a new resolve stirred the courage to face whatever darkness might come, armed with the hard-won strength of faith forged in fear. The town was not yet safe, but the first light had come, and with it, the chance to fight back. Elias took a deep breath, stepping out into the awakening town, the weight of the silent bells heavy, but no longer crushing. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the dawn offered a fragile hope, a promise that even in the deepest shadows, light could find a way to grow. The bells had fallen silent, but the echoes of their toll would linger, a reminder that the battle between faith and fear was far from over. As the sun rose higher, painting the Gothic spires of the church in hues of gold and rose, Elias knew the silence would not last forever. Yet in this moment, the town of Raven's Hollow dared to breathe again, held in the fragile embrace of the first light. The first light of dawn spilled pale and tentative over Raven's Hollow, casting long shadows that flickered across the snow-dusted streets. The town was waking slowly, as if reluctant to face the day after the long nightmare that had gripped it. The air was crisp and still, breaking only with the soft murmur of voices and the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground. In the town square, a handful of survivors gathered, their faces drawn and weary, eyes heavy with exhaustion yet flickering with the fragile ember of hope. Elias Marrow stood among them, his breath visible in the icy air, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn coat. His gaze was fixed on the Gothic church that loomed over the town like a sentinel. Its once malevolent presence now seemed quieter, almost mournful. The bells had fallen silent, their clamor replaced by an uneasy calm. Around him, the returned townsfolk shuffled, their movements slow, as if still caught between worlds. Some bore faint scars, pale marks etched into their skin like whispered secrets of the Belwraith's curse. They exchanged wary glances, searching for reassurance that the horror was truly over. Mara Divlin, tall and austere in her clerical robes, moved gracefully through the crowd, her sharp eyes scanning faces with a mixture of compassion and resolve. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear, carrying the weight of tradition and faith. "We must not forget what has passed," she urged, "but neither must we allow fear to govern our souls. Today, we begin anew, with prayer and vigilance." The church doors opened wide, releasing a waft of incense that curled through the cold air, mingling with the quiet breaths of those gathered. Mara led the survivors inside, where the flicker of candlelight danced on ancient stone walls etched with centuries of devotion and suffering. The ritual she performed was one of cleansing and protection, a solemn act to seal away the darkness that had nearly consumed them. Elias watched from the back of the church, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. The faith he had abandoned after his sister's tragic death now stirred uneasily within him, a fragile thing, distorted yet persistent. He found himself drawn to the flickering flames and the murmured prayers, the sound of voices united in defiance against the lingering shadows. For the first time in years, a tentative hope kindled within him, fragile but real. Later, seeking solitude, Elias retreated to his small study, where a desk cluttered with papers and books awaited. The window pane was frosted, the snow continuing its silent descent beyond. He opened his journal, the familiar weight of pen in hand grounding him as he began to write. Each word was a thread weaving his thoughts and memories into a tapestry of understanding, a testament to the ordeal endured and the lessons learned. He wrote not only to remember but to confront the fears that still haunted him, to chart a path forward through the darkness. Outside, the town began to stir with cautious energy. Jonas Pike, broad-shouldered and soot-stained from his work at the forge, moved through the streets speaking quietly with those who had returned. His skepticism had been a shield, but the events had changed him, forging a deeper resolve to protect his family and community. He exchanged a brief, knowing look with a returned townsman near the church's shadow, both men silently acknowledging the fragile thread by which their lives now hung. As the day wore on, the cracks beneath Raven's Hollow's surface became apparent. Paranoia still simmered, distrust whispered in corners where fear had once taken root. The scars left by the Bellwraith's terror were not only visible, but etched deep within the hearts of the townsfolk. Yet amidst the shadows, the community gathered strength, drawing together to rebuild what had been broken. Elias closed his journal as dusk began to fall, the sky painted in bruised purples and pale golds. He stepped outside, the chill of the evening pressing against his skin. Above, the Gothic spires of the church reached into the darkening sky, silent but watchful. He knew the peace was fragile, that the darkness could return in another guise, waiting to prey upon their fears once more. But Elias was no longer the man who had doubted everything. His faith, reshaped by fire and shadow, had been forged anew. He was ready to face whatever toll the midnight bells might ring again. With a final glance at the church, Elias turned toward the quiet streets of Raven's Hollow, the weight of the past balanced by the promise of dawn. The scars beneath the snow would not be forgotten, but neither would the courage that had risen in their wake. And so the town breathed, fragile yet unbroken, beneath the watchful silence of the bells. The heavy silence inside the Gothic church was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the faintest sound. Elias Marrow sat in a pew near the nave's center, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air that seeped through the ancient stone walls. The flickering light of a single candle on the altar cast long, wavering shadows that danced like restless spirits. It was here, amidst the cold and the shadows, that Elias felt it most an echo, subtle yet unmistakable, threading its way through the stillness. A faint, almost imperceptible scream, human but warped and distant, as if carried on a thread of ice-laden wind. He closed his eyes, heart tightening in his chest. The Bellwraith was not gone, not completely. Though the bells had fallen silent, the malevolent presence lingered like a stain on the fabric of the church. His fingers tightened around the leather-bound journal resting on his lap. He had documented every strange occurrence, every whispered rumor, every vanished soul. Yet, despite the evidence, despite the rituals and the battles waged within the church's darkened crypts, the dread persisted. Elias's skepticism had morphed into a cautious belief, a belief tempered by fear and frailty. Outside, the town of Raven's Hollow lay blanketed in snow, the streets empty save for the occasional flicker of lantern light. The townsfolk moved carefully, their eyes darting toward the looming silhouette of the church, its spires piercing the night like jagged teeth. The memory of the bell's human screams still haunted their dreams. Jonas Pike trudged through the snow toward his home, the weight of exhaustion pulling at his broad shoulders. His hands, perpetually stained with soot from the forge, trembled not from cold but from the raw edge of fear that had gripped him since the last disappearance. The close call with his family had shaken him to the core. His wife and children were safe for now, but the threat loomed larger than ever. As he opened the creaking door, the warm glow of the hearth greeted him. His wife looked up, relief flooding her face, and his children clustered around, their eyes wide with a mixture of innocence and apprehension. Jonas pulled them close, the solid reality of their warmth and breath grounding him. He whispered promises to protect them, to stand against the darkness that had claimed so many. That night, as the wind howled beyond the wooden walls, Jonas's resolve steeled. He needed allies. Elias was the one man who understood the peril, who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Their friendship, forged in the fires of shared struggle, would be their town's bulwark. Back at the church, Mara Devlin moved with quiet purpose. Her tall frame was draped in austere clerical robes, her sharp eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight as she prepared for the evening prayer. The congregation gathered reluctantly, faces drawn and voices low. Fear had corroded their faith, and Mara knew the fragile threads holding their community together were fraying rapidly. She spoke with measured gravity, invoking ancient rites and old prayers, reminding them that their strength lay in belief. The Bellwraith feeds on doubt, she preached, on the fractures in our souls. We must be steadfast. We must hold to our faith, for it is the only shield we have against the darkness that seeks to consume us. Her words hung heavy in the cold air, mingling with the scent of burning wax and aged wood. Some nodded, clutching rosaries and holy texts, but others remained distant, their eyes clouded with fear and uncertainty. Later, beneath a sky devoid of stars, Elias and Jonas met in the snow-dusted churchyard. The silence between them was thick, laden with unspoken fears and shared burdens. Jonas broke it first, his voice low but resolute. "We can't let this town fall apart. Not after everything." Elias nodded, his dark hair tousled by the biting wind. "The Bellwraith is still here. It's waiting, watching. We need to find a way to keep it from rising again." They stood together, two figures silhouetted against the dark outline of the church, their breath mingling in the frigid air. In that moment, their alliance was more than friendship, it was a pact forged in the shadow of fear, a beacon against the encroaching night. Yet even as they spoke, a faint, chilling sound rippled through the air, a whisper of a scream, carried on the wind, threading through the church walls, an echo of the horror still lurking just beyond the edge of sight. Elias shivered, knowing that the battle was far from over. The fragile calm was a veneer, a fleeting reprieve. The Bellwraith's echo haunted the edges of their lives, a reminder that faith, while powerful, was a fragile weapon against a darkness born of despair and corrupted belief. As Elias looked up at the silent bells, he asked himself the question that would haunt him through the coming days. Could faith truly hold back a force as persistent and insidious as the Bellwraith? The church stood silent but watchful, its bells dormant yet ever present, waiting for the moment when the next toll would sound. And Elias, Mara, and Jonas would be ready, or so they hoped, to face whatever darkness that toll would bring. The cold settled over Raven's Hollow like a shroud, thick and relentless, muffling the world beneath its unyielding blanket of snow. In the pale light of the moon, the town lay quiet, streets deserted and frosted, as if holding its breath against the creeping dread that had become a part of its very essence. Yet, just as midnight struck, an eerie sound cut through the stillness, the faint tolling of the church bells. Unlike the robust peals of old, these were thin, ghostly, and distant, drifting across the frozen landscape like a whispered warning. Elias Marrow stood at his study window, the chill seeping into his bones as he watched the bell's slow, mournful rhythm echo in the darkness. His breath fogged the glass, and his heart tightened with the familiar pang of unease. The toll was faint, but it carried the same haunting quality he had come to dread, the subtle human scream woven into each chime, a sound that had once shattered the town's fragile peace. Determined not to succumb to the paralysis of fear, Elias wrapped his coat tighter and stepped out into the night. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way toward the edge of town, his lantern casting trembling shadows among the skeletal trees. The air was sharp and biting, carrying the scent of pine and frost, but beneath it lingered something else, an intangible weight that pressed against his chest. As he reached the outskirts, the world felt emptier, the silence deeper. His footsteps faltered when he noticed the disturbed earth near the ancient boundary stones, the snow scraped away in strange, deliberate patterns. Fingers of frost traced cryptic symbols carved into the frozen ground, faint but unmistakable. Elias knelt, brushing snow aside to reveal the dark etchings. His fingers trembled not from cold, but from the creeping certainty that the bell-wraith's reach was extending beyond the church walls. Back in the heart of Raven's Hollow, the fragile calm shattered like glass. The town hall, usually a sanctuary of order, buzzed with tension as voices rose in anxious bursts. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Whispered accusations tangled with desperate pleas for understanding. Jonas Pike, broad-shouldered and fierce-eyed, stood between factions, trying to quell the unrest, but the undercurrent of fear was too strong. Sheriff Alden's stern gaze swept the room, his usual composure strained by the weight of inexplicable disappearances and the persistent rumors swirling like a storm. "We can't let this fear tear apart," Jonah said, voice steady despite the quiver beneath. "We need to trust each other more than ever." But trust was a fragile thing in Raven's Hollow, and the night's tolling bells seemed to unravel it thread by thread. Elias returned to the church, the ancient wooden doors looming ahead, dark and unyielding beneath the bleak sky. Mara Devlin stood beside him, her expression grave but resolute. The sharp lines of her face were softened only by the flickering candlelight she carried, illuminating the carved stone steps worn by centuries of footsteps and prayers. Together they listened as the faint bells tolled once more, a sound both chilling and sorrowful. "The darkness is not yet gone," Mara whispered, her voice steady but laced with warning. "We must be vigilant." Elias nodded, a surge of determination rising within him. The night was thick with fear, but also with the stubborn flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished. He knew the path ahead would test the limits of his resolve, between faith and doubt, between despair and courage. And as the last echoes of the toll faded into the winter air, he vowed to stand firm, to protect Raven's Hollow from the shadow growing ever closer. For in the lingering toll of those bells lay a warning and a challenge that he could not ignore. The wind sharpened, carrying with it the distant howl of wolves and the uneasy rustle of dry branches scraping against stone. Elias's gaze hardened as he turned away from the church, the weight of responsibility settling like armor around his shoulders. The battle was far from over. The bell-wraith's shadow stretched beyond the town's borders, and the fractures within the community threatened to become chasms. Yet beneath the cold night sky, the faint toll of the bells marked not just an end, but a beginning. And Elias, despite the gnawing uncertainty, would face whatever came with the clarity of purpose born from fear and faith entwined. He paused on the frozen path, the lantern's light flickering against the dark, and breathed in the icy air. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled once more, and with it, the echo of a promise silent but unyielding that Raven's Hollow would endure. The snow fell relentlessly over Raven's Hollow, a heavy, suffocating weight that muffled sound and blurred the edges of the world. Streets disappeared beneath thick blankets of white, and the Gothic spires of the ancient church loomed like dark sentinels against a sky swollen with storm clouds. Inside his small, drafty cabin on the edge of town, Elias Marrow sat with his coat still damp, staring out the frost-rimed window. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within him, a tempest of memories and fears stirred by the Bellwraith's relentless assault. Since the bells had begun their cursed tolling, twisting sound into a weapon of despair, Elias had felt his grip on reality fray. But tonight, the entity's power was at its cruelest. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, and with every howl of the wind, the ghostly cries of his sister Clara echoed in his mind. He could almost see her pale face, twisted in terror, the memory of that night clawing at his soul. A sudden knock at the door broke his torment. Mara Devlin stood framed in the swirling snow, her clerical robes dusted white, eyes sharp and unwavering despite the storm's fury. She entered without waiting, a comforting presence amid the cold and shadow. "Elias," she said softly, setting a small bundle of herbs and candles on his worn table. "The Bellwraith feeds on your grief. It twists your pain to weaken your spirit. You must not let it consume you." He shook his head, voice hoarse. "I see her every night. Her screams. I can't." Mara placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. "Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to stand despite it. We will face this darkness together." Outside, Jonas Pike labored in his forge, the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal a defiant heartbeat against the storm's silence. His broad shoulders bore the weight of responsibility as he fashioned crude weapons and reinforced barriers, preparing the town for whatever horrors the Bellwraith might unleash next. Sweat mingled with soot on his skin, but his eyes burned with determination. Protecting his family and friends was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. Back inside, Mara led Elias through prayers and rituals passed down through generations, her voice weaving through the cabin like a lifeline. She spoke of resilience, of light piercing darkness, and the strength found in shared belief. Slowly, Elias felt the crushing weight of despair ease, replaced by a flicker of something fragile but vital hope. Yet the Bellwraith was not so easily thwarted. That night, as Elias lay beneath threadbare blankets, the entity invaded his dreams. Shadows twisted into Clara's form, her voice a mournful melody of accusation and sorrow. The church bells tolled in the distance, their screams melding with the wind, a symphony of torment that threatened to break him. Elias clenched his fists, biting back the rising panic. "No," he whispered fiercely, "I will not be your prisoner." The storm raged on, but within the fragile sanctuary of the church and the fortifications forged by Jonas, the people of Raven's Hollow braced themselves. Faith, fear, and the sound of hope intertwined, setting the stage for the battles yet to come. Outside, the snow swallowed the town in silence, but inside, the fight for Raven's Hollow had only just begun. The morning brought no relief. Snow blanketed the streets like a shroud, muffling footsteps and cloaking the world in white. Elias and Mara met in the church's nave, where flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the ornate wooden pews and stained glass windows. The air was thick with incense and unspoken fears. "The Bellwraith's power grows with the storm," Mara said, her voice low but resolute. "It uses the cold and isolation to deepen despair. We must strengthen the bonds between us." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. He had to set aside his doubts, not just for himself, but for the town that looked to him now, however reluctantly. He pulled his journal from his satchel, its pages filled with observations, prayers, and desperate questions. "Jonas is preparing the town," Elias said. "We can't face this with prayers alone." Mara's eyes flickered with a mix of understanding and sadness. "Faith is our foundation, but action is its echo. We must do both." As they spoke, the church bells tolled faintly, a distant, distorted echo carried on the wind. Though muffled by the storm, the sound sent a chill through the room, a reminder of the enemy lurking just beyond their fragile defenses. Later, Elias ventured out briefly, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he moved through the near-deserted streets. He caught sight of Jonas at the forge, sweat streaked and fierce, hammer ringing against iron. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Elias drew strength from the blacksmith's steadfast resolve. Returning to the church, Elias paused before a weathered statue of an angel, its wings dusted with snow, eyes forever fixed on the heavens. He whispered a vow not to forget Clara, not to let fear claim the town, and not to surrender to the dark. Night fell again, darker and deeper beneath the storm's relentless grip. Inside the church, Mara and Elias prepared for the next confrontation, their spirits entwined in a fragile but unyielding stand against the Bell-Wraith's haunting tide. The battle for Raven's Hollow was far from over, and the shadows in the snow promised more trials yet to come. Elias's journey through the storm was one of pain and perseverance, as the Bell-Wraith sought to unravel him with memories of loss and shadowed fear. But with Mara's guidance and Jonas's steadfast protection, a fragile hope kindled amid the cold, and darker hope that faith, even when fractured, could be reforged in the crucible of fear. As the snow swirled and the bells tolled faintly in the distance, Raven's Hollow braced itself. The shadows in the snow were not just winter's chill, they were the whispers of a darkness yet to be fully faced. A darkness Elias would have to confront not only in the world but within himself. The biting cold gnawed at Elias's cheeks as he and Mara stood beneath the looming bell tower, the ancient stones groaning faintly beneath the weight of snow and years. After days of searching through crumbling ledgers and whispered confessions, they had finally found the concealed entrance Mara had suspected lay hidden beneath the floorboards of the bell chamber. With a shared glance, Mara knelt and pressed against the warped wooden planks, her fingers tracing the faint outline of a seam. Elias shifted his weight, muscles tense, as the first screeching toll of midnight shattered the night air, the sound reverberating through the frigid stillness. The bells seemed alive, wailing with a raw, human agony that made Elias's skin crawl. Together they levered the boards aside, revealing a narrow stone stair spiraling downward into darkness. Dust rose in lazy clouds, catching the faint moonlight that filtered through cracks above. A musty scent of decay and forgotten secrets enveloped them. "Stay close," Mara whispered, lighting a slender candle with trembling hands. The flame flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed across the uneven walls. The descent was treacherous, each step uneven, slick with centuries of neglect. Elias's breath came in shallow puffs, the cold biting through his worn jacket as the oppressive silence pressed in around them. Somewhere deep below, the muffled tolling of the bells throbbed like a heartbeat, both distant and intimately close. At the bottom, they found themselves in a small chamber, its walls lined with ancient stone blocks etched in faded runes and symbols. Shelves carved into the rock cradled brittle scrolls, cracked leather-bound tomes, and artifact relics coated in dust. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment, and something more elusive, an undercurrent of despair and lingering faith. Mara approached a lectern, carefully unrolling a yellowed scroll with trembling fingers. Her voice was a low murmur as she read aloud passages in Latin, words heavy with invocation and warning. Elias leaned in, eyes scanning the delicate script. The writing spoke of a guardian spirit corrupted, once a protector of the town, now twisted by centuries of neglect and dark rites into the Bell-Wraith, a malevolent force bound to the bells. "It says here," Mara said, her voice steady despite the weight of the revelation, "there is a ritual, a severing rite, that can break the entity's connection to the bells. But it demands great sacrifice and unwavering faith." Elias swallowed hard, the old skepticism warring with a growing sense of urgency. "Do we have the time?" Before Mara could answer, a low rumble vibrated through the chamber, the bell ropes above beginning to sway, as if stirred by an unseen hand. The tolling grew louder, more insistent, echoing with the same chilling human screams that had haunted their nights. Elias's gaze fell upon a rusted iron object resting on a pedestal, a bell clapper, ornately carved but worn by age. He reached out, the metal cold and heavy in his palm, a tangible connection to the malevolent force they sought to undo. "We must prepare," Mara said solemnly, her eyes glinting with fierce determination. "The entity knows we are here. It will not relinquish its hold without a fight." A sudden gust of frigid wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing their candles and plunging them into pitch blackness. The bell tolls crescendoed, a mocking symphony of despair that seemed to seep into the very stones. Elias steadied his breath, feeling the weight of the relic in his hand and the unyielding presence of Mara beside him. In that suffocating darkness, the fragile line between faith and fear blurred, but beneath it all, a stubborn ember of hope burned fiercely. They had found the secret. Now, the true battle awaited. The ancient chamber whispered its secrets to them, tales of faith corrupted, hope twisted into terror. Scrolls revealed the method, a ritual combining sacred prayers with the ringing of a consecrated bell, designed to sever the Bellwraith's cursed bond. Yet the cost was clear. Such power demanded sacrifice, a surrender of fear and a renewal of belief. Elias traced the faded script with trembling fingers, the words both foreign and strangely familiar. "We need to gather the relics and prepare the ritual," he said, voice low but resolute. "If we fail, the town is lost." Mara nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We must act quickly. The Bellwraith grows stronger with each toll." Together, they collected the scattered artifacts, a silver cross tarnished by time, a vial of consecrated oil, and a bell wrought from an ancient, blessed bronze alloy. As Elias lifted the bell, a shiver ran through him, not from the cold, but from the palpable energy thrumming within it. Outside the chamber, the bell tower seemed to pulse with malevolence. Shadows twisted in unnatural ways, and the distant howls of the wind mingled with the spectral screams echoing from the bells themselves. "This place," Mara whispered, "is a crucible of faith and fear. We must be strong." Elias's mind raced, memories of Clara's death swirling like a storm. The Bellwraith had toyed with his grief before, exploiting every fracture in his resolve. But now, armed with knowledge and the strength of Mara's faith, he felt a flicker of something new, a readiness to confront the darkness head-on. They ascended the stone stairs, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily upon them. Each step was a battle against the rising tide of dread, but also a march toward hope. As they emerged into the bell chamber, the ropes swayed violently, and the bells tolled with a fury that shook the very air. The Bellwraith sensed their defiance. Elias raised the consecrated bell, the metal gleaming dully in the dim light, and Mara began to intone the ancient prayers, her voice steady and unwavering. The chamber filled with a sound both pure and fierce, a counterpoint to the twisted screams emanating from the great bells. The battle for Raven's Hollow had entered a new, perilous phase. Time was running out, and the fragile hope they carried was all that stood between salvation and oblivion. Outside, the snow fell silently, blanketing the town in a deceptive calm. But within the heart of the bell tower, faith and fear clashed in a desperate struggle, forging the fate of all who dwelled beneath its shadow. The heavy wooden doors of the Gothic church groaned open, admitting a biting gust of winter air that swept through the nave, carrying with it the sharp scent of frost and ancient stone. Inside, the townsfolk of Raven's Hollow gathered, their breath visible in the cold, eyes wide with fear and determination. The flickering candlelight cast long, wavering shadows across the vaulted ceilings, dimly illuminating the worn pews and the towering altar draped in faded crimson cloth. Mara Devlin stood at the center of the circle, her tall, austere figure framed by the towering stained glass windows that filtered the weak light of the fading afternoon. Her sharp, penetrating eyes swept over the gathered faces, some familiar, others drawn tight with anxiety. She raised her hands, palms outward, and began a low, steady chant in the ancient tongue passed down through generations. The language seemed to resonate with the very stones of the church, weaving a solemn spell of protection and purification. Elias Marrow stood beside her, clutching the worn leather-bound journal that had become his constant companion. His dark hair was tousled from restless nights, and his pale skin seemed almost translucent in the flickering candlelight. His lean frame was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring, yet his eyes shone with a fierce resolve that belied the turmoil within. Beside him, Jonas Pike's rugged form was a pillar of silent strength, soot-stained hands clenched tightly as he surveyed the crowd. As the chant grew in intensity, a sudden, violent tolling shattered the fragile calm. The church bells, long silent since the first sinister midnight cries, erupted with a deafening clang that twisted into distorted, agonized screams. The sound was no longer merely metal striking metal. It was a cacophony of human torment, echoing with the voices of the vanished, their cries writhing through the air like a living thing. A shudder ran through the gathered townsfolk. Some staggered, clutching their ears, faces contorted in pain and fear. A child cried out, but Mara's steady voice rose above the chaos, commanding silence and fortitude. Elias's jaw clenched as the screams burrowed into his mind, threatening to unravel him. Yet he stood firm, eyes fixed on the altar, willing himself not to succumb. The Bellwraith's assault was not merely sonic, it was deeply personal. Suddenly, the shadows around Elias thickened, twisting into grotesque shapes that morphed into the haunting visage of his sister Clara. Her pale face, framed by dark hair, appeared amidst the swirling darkness, eyes wide and pleading. The cold snow of that fateful night stained crimson around her, silent screams frozen in time. Elias's breath caught. The memories surged forward with unbearable clarity, the ritual gone wrong, the desperate prayers, the helplessness. For a moment, the weight of grief threatened to crush him. But deep within, a flicker of something stronger than sorrow ignited a stubborn ember of faith, fragile yet unyielding. Mara's voice cut through the haze as she sprinkled salt and holy water over the gathered crowd, her movements precise and deliberate. Jonas moved alongside her, his broad shoulders shielding the vulnerable, his presence a steady anchor. Together their voices rose in unison, blending with Elias's slow, steady breaths, a chorus of resistance against the encroaching darkness. The Bellwraith's howls faltered, its spectral faces contorting in rage and confusion as the oppressive sound began to waver. The shadows retreated inch by inch, dissolving into the cold stone corners of the church. A hush fell, broken only by the labored breathing of the weary and the faint crackle of extinguishing candles. The ritual was incomplete, the battle far from over, but in that fragile silence, a fragile hope took root. Elias felt the first true warmth since the terror began, a warmth born not from certainty, but from the courage to face the unknown and the resolve to protect what remained. As the last echoes of the Bellwraith's scream faded into the winter night, Elias exchanged a glance with Mara and Jonas. The road ahead would be perilous, but for the first time, the darkness seemed surmountable. The bells might toll again, but the town and its guardian were ready to answer. And somewhere deep within the ancient stones, the whispered voices of the disappeared lingered, a reminder that this fight was not just for survival, but for redemption itself. The night held its breath, waiting for the next toll. The church sanctuary was suffused with a suffocating stillness that belied the storm raging within Elias Marrow's mind. Candles flickered against the ancient stone walls, their wavering light casting grotesque shadows that danced like specters in the gloom. Elias stood near the altar, his knees weak, breath uneven, as the oppressive presence of the Bellwraith seeped into every corner of the sacred space. The heavy toll of the cursed bells still reverberated faintly in his ears, a tormenting echo that gnawed at his resolve. Around him, Mara Devlin chanted solemn prayers, her austere voice rising and falling like the tide, a fragile bulwark against the encroaching darkness. Jonas Pike remained close by, his broad frame a physical anchor in the swirling chaos. Yet despite their combined efforts, the malevolent force tightened its grip, weaving tendrils of despair into Elias's very soul. A sudden surge of sound, an unholy chorus of screams twisted by malice burst forth from the bell tower, shaking the stained glass windows and rattling the very foundations of the church. Elias staggered, clutching at the altar rail, his mind fracturing under the relentless assault. Memory-sharp, jagged shards of the past pierced his consciousness with the vividness of a nightmare. He saw Clara, his sister, fragile and terrified, caught in the terrible ritual that had long haunted Raven's Hollow's dark history. Her face twisted in anguish, her voice crying out in futile protest as the ancient rites claimed her. The pain of loss, buried deep beneath years of skepticism and doubt, surged forth with cruel clarity. Elias's heart clenched, tears blurring his vision as the Belwraith's whispers crawled into his mind, twisting his grief into a weapon aimed at breaking him. "You failed her," the voice hissed, echoing through the recesses of his soul. "Faith abandoned, love betrayed." The bitter accusation struck with the force of a physical blow, and Elias sank to his knees, trembling, breath ragged. His journal lay forgotten at his feet, pages fluttering in the chill draught that seeped through the cracked stained glass. The sanctuary felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls themselves conspired to trap him in this waking torment.
Elias!
Jonas's voice cut through the darkness like a lifeline. Rough hands gripped his shoulder, steady and unwavering. "Look at me. You're not alone. We're fighting this together." The contact was grounding, a tactile anchor pulling Elias back from the abyss. He forced his gaze upward, meeting Jonas's determined eyes. The blacksmith's rugged face was etched with concern but also fierce resolve. "You can't give in," Jonas said firmly. "Not now. Not when the whole town depends on you." Mara stepped forward, her voice rising above the cacophony of spectral screams. "Hold fast, Elias. Faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to stand despite it." Her words resonated deep within him, stirring embers of a belief long dormant. Elias swallowed hard, wiping the tears from his cheeks as he drew a shaky breath. The Belwraith's assault persisted, the sound twisting and warping around him, but something within Elias shifted, a fragile seed of hope breaking through the despair. He straightened slowly, muscles trembling but resolve hardening. "I won't let it win," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Not this time." Jonas nodded, a ghost of a smile flickering beneath his soot-stained face. "That's the spirit." Together, the trio resumed their places in the ritual circle, their voices rising in unison against the night's terror. Elias felt the weight of his grief and doubt like chains, but with each word spoken, each note of prayer and defiance, the chains loosened. The Belwraith's power surged once more, a tempest of sound and shadow, but Elias met it head-on, drawing strength from his companions, and the fragile yet unyielding spark of faith rekindled within him. The battle for Raven's Hollow was far from over, but in this crucible of darkness, Elias found the courage to stand firm against the encroaching night. As the echoes of the bells faded into a sullen silence, a new determination settled over the sanctuary. The breaking point had been reached, and Elias' marrow, scarred but unbroken, prepared to face whatever horrors awaited beyond the veil of sound and shadow. The narrow stone staircase spiraled upward into darkness, each step Elias took echoing hollowly beneath his boots. The bitter air clung to him, seeping through his practical winter clothes, chilling his bones even as adrenaline surged. Above, the bells tolled relentlessly, their sound a cacophony of agonized screams that seemed to claw at his very soul. With every toll, the air thickened heavy with despair, corrupted faith, and a malevolence that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Elias gripped the cold iron railing, steadying himself against the mounting terror. His breath came in ragged puffs, misting in the frigid air as he ascended toward the heart of the nightmare. At last, he emerged into the bell chamber, a cavernous space crowned by towering bronze bells. They hung like ancient sentinels, their surfaces alive with an eerie shimmer. Elias's eyes widened in horror as ghostly faces writhed across the bronze, silent screams frozen in torment. Their distorted visages shifting with every flicker of candlelight he carried. Shadows coalesced and twisted in unnatural ways, forming a dark mass that pulsed with a dreadful life, the Belwraith. It was more terrible than he had imagined, a shifting shadow intertwined with the bell ropes and bronze, a monstrous embodiment of corrupted faith and despair. Its form flickered between the tangible and the ethereal, faces emerging and dissolving in a tormenting cycle of agony. The air vibrated with a chilling, oppressive weight, the malevolent force warping reality within the tower. Elias steadied himself, recalling Mara's voice steady in his mind, her prayers, her knowledge of ancient rites. He reached for the bell ropes, fingers trembling but resolute. He began to tap out a rhythm he'd learned from the old texts, a cadence meant to counter the dark symphony the bell wraith unleashed. As he did, he recited prayers, words once lost to his doubt, but now clawing back through the haze of fear. The bell wraith responded with a cacophony of dissonant screams that pierced the chamber, shaking the very stones. Elias staggered, clutching at his head as visions erupted before his eyes. Clara's death replayed in harrowing detail, the cold void of loss. His faith shattered into a million shards. The entity fed on these fears, twisting his doubts into weapons against him. But Elias fought back. He forced his mind to focus, grounding himself in the memories of his sister, not as a source of despair, but as a beacon of resilience. The rhythm of his tapping grew stronger, his voice clearer. The bells answered his call, their tone shifting from screams to a pure, ringing clarity that cut through the darkness. The bell wraith shrieked in fury, its form flickering violently as the sound unraveled its hold. The ghostly faces writhed in agony, the shadows unspooling like smoke caught in a sudden gust. For a moment, the entire tower seemed to tremble as the entity fought to maintain its grip. Then, with a final, piercing toll, the bellwraith dissipated, vanishing into nothingness as the bells fell silent. Elias collapsed against the cold stone wall, breathing hard, sweat mingling with the frost on his skin. Silence settled like a fragile shroud. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving only the echo of his ragged breaths and the faint, fading resonance of the last bell. He remained there, alone amidst the stillness, the enormity of what he had faced crashing upon him. The battle was won, but the scars, both visible and unseen, would linger. Elias's faith, once broken, now felt tempered, forged in the crucible of terror and hope. The church, the town, and perhaps even he himself would never be the same. Yet as he gazed out from the bell tower window at the snow-blanketed town below, a quiet resolve stirred. The darkness might return, but so would he, stronger, ready to face whatever the night might toll. A distant wind whispered through the bell ropes, the faintest echo of a bell's ring carried on the icy air. Elias's eyes narrowed. The fight was far from over. The bitter cold of the bell tower seeped through every thread of Elias's marrows-worn coat, but he hardly noticed. His eyes fixed upward, watching the shadowed bronze bells, their surfaces alive with twisting, tormented faces that screamed silently into the night. The bellwraith pulsed within them, a malevolent force feeding on the town's fear, its voice a cacophony of anguish and despair that threatened to shatter his resolve. He clenched his jaw, the chill in his bones matched by the icy grip of doubt and dread clawing at his mind. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was not alone. The memories of Raven's Hollow, of those who had vanished and those who still clung to hope, surged within him. Most of all, Clara's face, her smile, fragile and pure, burned through the darkness like a beacon. The bellwraith's scream twisted into a low, grinding rumble, the sound warping and bending as it sought to invade his thoughts. Elias's hands trembled, but he forced his breath steady, grounding himself in the memory of his sister's laughter, the warmth of her presence before tragedy stole her away. This was no longer a fight of fear. It was a battle for faith in himself, in the people of Raven's Hollow, and in the light that could pierce even the deepest shadows. Below, the faint sound of Mara's voice drifted upward, a litany of prayers ancient as the stones themselves. Her words wove through the cold air, a fragile but potent shield of spiritual strength. Jonas's steady presence was felt even without sight. The blacksmith's quiet courage bolstered Elias's faltering will. Drawing a ragged breath, Elias reached out with his mind, coaxing the twisted sound of the bells into something new, a melody not of terror, but of hope. The dissonant screams twisted and reformed, weaving into a fragile harmony that pulsed with a warmth the bell wraith could not consume. The entity writhed, its form fracturing as the music struck at its core. Faces within the bells twisted in agony, their screams decrescendoing into desperate whispers. Elias felt the weight of centuries of despair begin to lift, replaced by a fragile light that spread through the bell tower like dawn breaking a long night. The bell wraith's hold on the town weakened, its power unraveling thread by thread. Yet the battle was far from over. Elias knew the darkness would not yield easily, that the final confrontation awaited. But in this moment, amidst the ruins of fear and doubt, he found a spark of something stronger, faith forged in the crucible of terror. He steadied his stance, eyes fixed on the fractured shadow before him. The bells no longer screamed. They sang a song of survival, resilience, and the unyielding strength of a man who refused to surrender to the night. "This ends soon," Elias whispered to the empty tower, a vow as much as a promise. "I will not let you consume Raven's Hollow. Not while I still stand." The echo of his words mingled with the fading tolls, a fragile hope ringing out into the snowbound town below. And somewhere, deep within the fractured souls of the vanished, a faint stir of life answered the call. The narrow spiral staircase groaned under Elias Marrow's boots as he climbed higher into the bell tower. The chill of the winter night creeping through the ancient stone walls like a living thing. Each step echoed in the confined shaft, mingling with the distant, sorrowful tolling of the bells, a sound twisted by the bell wraith into a symphony of torment. Above him, the massive bronze bells swayed gently, their surfaces alive with writhing, ghostly faces that screamed without sound, a silent chorus of anguish that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Elias paused briefly on the landing, pressing a gloved hand against the cold iron railing. His breath fogged in the frigid air as he steadied himself, the weight of what lay ahead settling deep in his bones. Around his neck hung the silver charm Mara Divlin had given him, a slender talisman etched with ancient runes meant to shield and focus the spirit. It was fragile, but it was hope. Below, the town of Raven's Hollow lay buried beneath thick snow, its streets empty and silent in the grip of a fearful night. The missing townsfolk lingered somewhere beyond, trapped within the bellwraith's grasp, souls ensnared by sound and despair. Now all that remained was to end the nightmare. The final stones of the staircase gave way to the bell chamber, a cavernous space where the immense bells hung suspended, giant sentinels of bronze and shadow. Elias stepped into the chamber, and the temperature dropped further. The bells seemed to pulse, their faces shifting with unnatural life, eyes opening and closing, mouths stretching in silent screams. A low, guttural moan rose from the shadows, swelling into a cacophony of spectral voices that rattled the bones. From the darkness, the bell wraith emerged, a twisting, ethereal shadow intertwined with the bell ropes and metal framework. Its form was fluid, a living nightmare that flickered with the faces of the damned, their silent screams echoing in the cold air. The entity's presence was a suffocating weight, a manifestation of corrupted faith and unrelenting fear. Elias swallowed the lump in his throat and took a step forward. The bellwraith lashed out with a wave of sound, a shrieking assault that battered him like a physical blow. His ears rang, and the world trembled. Clutching the silver charm, he squeezed his eyes shut, reaching deep into the well of his transformed belief, of faith, forged in the crucible of fear and loss. Then, softly, he began to hum. The notes were hesitant at first. A fragile thread of melody pulled from the recesses of memory, an old hymn his mother had sung in the church when he was a boy. The sound wove through the chaos, a warm, steady pulse that pushed against the bellwraith's discordant screams. The entity recoiled, its shadowy form flickering and twisting as the holy resonance cut through the darkness. The faces on the bells contorted, their silent screams writhing into expressions of pain. Elias's voice grew stronger, the hymn rising in a crescendo that filled the chamber with light and sound, melting the shadows with a radiant hope. As the final words left his lips, the bells tolled once more, but this time the sound was pure, clear, and free of the malevolent distortion. The bellwraith shrieked in fury and despair, its form unraveling like smoke caught in the wind. With a final explosive toll that shook the very stones, the bells fell silent. An eerie stillness descended upon the tower, profound and sacred. Elias sank to the cold floor, his breath ragged but victorious. The weight of the terror that had gripped Raven's Hollow lifted, replaced by a fragile peace. Below, the missing townsfolk began to stir, returning from their spectral prison, changed but alive. The nightmare was over for now. But as Elias looked out over the snow-blanketed town through the frost-lined windows, he knew the silence was only the beginning. Faith and fear had clashed in deadly harmony, and the scars they left would linger like shadows beneath the snow. He rose slowly, the silver charm warm against his chest. The bells would toll again someday. But Elias Marrow was ready, armed now not just with knowledge, but with a faith tempered by darkness and hope, ready to face whatever toll the night would bring next. The church stood silent, watchful and eternal, and the night waited. The first light of dawn broke hesitantly over Raven's Hollow, casting pale hues on the snow-laden streets that had, for so long, been empty and silent. Word had spread quickly through the town overnight. The missing were returning. They came at first as shadows at the edges of the square, gaunt figures moving with uncertain steps, faces pale and eyes wide with haunted memories. Elias Marrow stood near the edge of the gathering crowd, his breath misting in the cold air as he watched with wary hope. The townsfolk had been gone for what felt like an eternity, swallowed by the night and the malevolent force tied to the church bells. Now, here they were back, but irrevocably changed. Mara Devlin was the first to step forward, her tall form resolute beneath the weight of her clerical robes. Her sharp eyes scanned each returned soul with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Come inside," she urged softly, beckoning them towards the sanctuary of the church. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning incense and the faint chill of the stone walls. Marek knelt beside a woman whose hands trembled uncontrollably, chanting prayers that wove through the silence like threads of light. Elias moved quickly to attend to a man whose skin bore a strange, bruised pattern that pulsed with an unholy glow beneath the surface. Despite his usual skepticism, Elias found himself shaken by the tangible weight of their suffering. The community hall soon became the heart of healing and reckoning. The room was filled with the murmurs of whispered stories, tentative steps toward understanding the horrors endured. Elias stood before the gathered crowd, his voice steady but weighted with the scars of recent nights. "We have faced darkness," he began, "and it sought to break us, to turn our faith to fear. But we endured. We stand here, together, not as victims but as survivors. Our wounds remind us of what was lost and what we must protect." Jonas Pike, ever the pragmatic protector, stood beside Elias, his soot-stained hands clenched tightly. "It's not just about faith," Jonas said quietly. "It's about each other. We keep each other safe. That's how we fight back." The tension in the room eased, replaced by a fragile hope. It was clear that the battle was won, but the war against fear and doubt had only just begun. The scars bore witness to the cost, but they also told a story of resilience. As twilight draped the town in a soft veil, Elias found himself drawn once more to the graveyard where Clara Marrow rested. The snow lay thick over the stones, muffling the world into a quiet reverence. He knelt beside her tombstone, the cold biting through his gloves as he brushed away a layer of snow. "I promised to protect this town," he whispered, voice raw with emotion. "To honor you and all we've lost. I will not let the darkness take hold again." The church bells remained silent, their menace quelled but not forgotten. The night's stillness was a fragile peace, a promise held in the breath between heartbeats. Elias rose, resolve hardening like the winter ice beneath his feet. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with the shadows of past fears and the weight of new responsibilities. But with Mara Jonas, and the town gathered in tentative unity. There was a flicker of light, small, but unyielding. Raven's Hollow had been tested by terror and betrayed by its own faith, yet it endured. In the crucible of despair, Elias found a new path, one forged not by blind belief, but by courage, empathy, and the unbreakable bonds of community. The bells might toll again someday, but when they did, the town would be ready. For now, the silence held, and with it, the promise of dawn. Snow fell steadily over Raven's Hollow, muffling the world in a cold, white silence that belied the turmoil still simmering beneath the surface. Inside his small, weather-worn home, Elias Marrow sat by the frost-laced window, the pale light of a single candle flickering over the pages of his journal. His pen moved steadily, tracing the tangled web of thoughts and memories that had haunted him since the bells fell silent. He wrote of fear raw, palpable, and suffocating. He wrote of faith shattered, fragile, yet stubbornly persistent. The scars left by the Bellwraith's terror were not only etched on the faces of the townsfolk or in the empty chairs around the supper tables. They were etched deep within the heart of Raven's Hollow itself. Elias knew the physical wounds would heal with time, but the emotional ones were more tenacious. They clung to the soul like the relentless winter chill outside. Across town, the Gothic church stood shrouded in shadow, the once ominous silhouette softened now by the gentle fall of snow. Mara Devlin moved with quiet purpose through the nave, her footsteps muffled by the ancient stone floor. The chill in the air was biting, and her breath came in soft clouds as she whispered prayers and blessings. Holy water sprinkled from her fingers, tracing shimmering droplets over the pews, the altar, and the worn stone statues that had long watched over the congregation. "May these walls be sanctified anew," Mara murmured, her voice steady despite the weight of recent events. The church had been a battleground, a place where faith and fear had clashed violently. Now it must become a sanctuary once more. Yet a trace of unease lingered in the air, a reminder that darkness could return when least expected. Outside, the forge's glow flickered against the encroaching twilight. Jonas Pike leaned against the doorframe of his smithy, the familiar heft of his hammer resting on his shoulder. His eyes scanned the darkening treelin, muscles taut beneath soot-stained hands. The disappearances had ended, but the memory of the Bellwraith's threat lingered, like a shadow waiting to pounce. Jonas's protective instincts remained sharp. He knew the town's fragile peace depended not only on faith or ritual but on vigilance. The community hall was a modest structure, its walls bearing witness to generations of gatherings, celebrations, and debates. Tonight, it was filled with a cautious assembly of Raven's Hollow's residents. Faces lined with fatigue and suspicion exchanged wary glances. The wounds inflicted by fear and distrust had left the town fractured. Some eyed Elias as a harbinger of truths too terrible to face. Others clung tightly to Mara's spiritual guidance, desperate for reassurance. "We must not let the past dictate our future," Mara addressed the room, her voice calm but resolute. "The darkness sought to divide us, but together we are stronger." Elias nodded quietly, sensing the fragile thread of hope that bound them all. Yet he knew healing would be a slow, painful process. Some scars were visible, but many ran deeper, etched beneath the snow, beneath the surface of everyday life. Back in his study, Elias closed his journal with a sigh. He rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-blanketed streets. The silence was profound, but it was not empty. It held the echoes of what had been lost and the promise of what might yet be reclaimed. As the night deepened, he whispered a prayer not for certainty, but for courage to face whatever darkness still lurked in the shadows of Raven's Hollow. The church bells remained silent, but their memory told in the hearts of the townspeople a solemn reminder that faith, like the winter snow, could both conceal and reveal the scars beneath. And somewhere in the quiet cold, Jonas's watchful eyes never faltered, a silent guardian against the night. The chapter closed not with the end of fear, but with the fragile dawn of hope, a testament to resilience in the face of lingering darkness. Yet the question remained, could Raven's Hollow truly heal, or would the scars beneath the snow forever mark its soul? As Elias turned away from the window, the wind whispered softly outside, carrying with it the faintest echo of a bell's toll, an unanswered question hanging in the stillness. The dawn broke over Raven's Hollow with a tentative softness, the sun's pale light casting long, delicate shadows across the snow-blanketed town. Elias Marrow stood quietly in the churchyard, his breath a faint mist in the chilly morning air. The towering Gothic spires of the church loomed high, their dark silhouettes softened by frost and the gentle glow of the new day. For the first time in many weeks, a sense of calm had begun to seep into the cold bones of the town, like a flicker of fragile light pushing back the pervasive darkness. Around him, the townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces drawn but hopeful, drawn to the ancient sanctuary that had once again become the heart of their community. The silence that had once been heavy with dread now carried a different weight, one of cautious optimism. Children, their cheeks flushed from the cold, darted between the adults, their laughter tentative but genuine, breaking the long-held stillness like a balm. Elias' gaze drifted upward, catching the fractured colors of the stained glass windows as the rising sun filtered through, casting kaleidoscopic patterns upon the worn stone walls. It was a quiet reminder that beauty persisted even in the bleakest places. Inside the church, Mara Devlin moved with a solemn grace, her austere figure framed by the flickering candlelight. She led the gathered townspeople in a ritual of renewal, her voice steady and clear as she intoned prayers that hung in the frosty air. The gentle murmur of hymns rose, weaving through the aged wood and stone, mingling with the faint creaks and whispers of the building itself. It was a fragile sanctuary, a place where hope could be nurtured amid the scars left by fear and despair. Jonas Pike, ever the pragmatist, worked tirelessly in his forge just beyond the churchyard. The steady clang of his hammer on metal echoed through the crisp air, a rhythmic heartbeat of determination and rebuilding. His broad shoulders bore the weight of responsibility, not only for his family, but for the community that had endured so much. His soot-streaked hands moved with practiced precision, repairing tools and reinforcing doors, tangible acts of protection and resilience. Outside, the sounds of life returning to the streets stirred a warmth in the air, the subtle but profound hum of a town slowly reclaiming itself. Elias returned to his modest home as twilight crept in, the sky shifting from the soft hues of dusk to the deep blues of night. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that flickered across his thoughtful features. His journal lay open on his lap, pages filled with hurried scrawls and reflections on the harrowing journey that had brought him here. The silence outside was profound, the church bells remaining still for now, their ominous tolls replaced by a quiet vigilance. Yet their absence was a presence in itself, a solemn reminder of the darkness endured and the fragile hope forged in its wake. As he wrote, Elias felt a shifting within himself, a renewal of purpose that had seemed impossible not long ago. The ordeal had shaken his beliefs to their core, but it had also kindled a new understanding that faith was not a simple refuge from fear, but a complex, sometimes painful journey through it. He thought of Mara's steady guidance, Jonas's steadfast support, and the resilience of the townsfolk who dared to hope despite everything. Raven's Hollow was scarred, yes, but it was still standing, and perhaps that was the greatest triumph of all. Outside, the wind whispered softly through the bare branches, carrying with it the promise of a new season. The darkness had not vanished entirely. Elias knew that much too well, but for now, there was light. A flicker, fragile yet undeniable, shining against the endless night. And as the last embers of the fire glowed warm and steady, Elias allowed himself to believe that this light might just be enough to guide them through whatever shadows still lingered. The church, dark and foreboding as ever, stood not as a monument to fear, but as a beacon of survival and resilience. It was a place where faith and doubt intertwined, where fear had been met with courage, and where the battle for Raven's Hollow's soul had been fought and, for now, won. But as Elias closed his journal and looked out into the night, a persistent question lingered in the silence. Could this fragile peace hold? Would the flicker of light withstand the darkness that still whispered beyond the edges of their world? The night was still, but the story was far from over. And so, beneath the watchful eyes of the silent bells, Elias prepared himself ready to face whatever came next. Armed with the hard-won strength of hope and faith forged in the crucible of fear, the study in old man Griggs's home was cloaked in shadows, the feeble light of a single oil lamp flickering against the walls lined with brittle pages and faded photographs. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and dust, a tangible reminder of decades past. Griggs, his white hair tousled and spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, unfolded a yellowed map that depicted Raven's Hollow as it had been centuries ago. His voice, though frail, carried the weight of the town's collective memory as he spoke. This place, Griggs began, fingers tracing the intricate lines marking the church's original foundations, was meant to be a sanctuary, a beacon of faith amidst the harshness of the world. But time has a way of twisting even the purest intentions. The Bellwraith wasn't always a curse, it was once a guardian, bound here to protect us. But centuries of neglect, fear, and misguided rituals tainted its purpose. Elias listened intently, the flicker of lamplight revealing the shadows beneath his dark eyes. The weight of Griggs's words settled heavily on his shoulders, mingling with the residual fear and hope that had carried him through the past weeks. The historian's voice softened as he continued, "Remembering is our strongest defense. Forgetting only leaves us vulnerable to the darkness creeping beneath the snow." After hours steeped in the town's history, Elias stepped out into the biting twilight, the cold air biting at his cheeks. The streets of Raven's Hollow lay silent under a thick blanket of snow, muffling the world into an eerie stillness. His breath misted before him as he made his way toward the outskirts where the small cemetery lay. Clara's grave was a modest stone slab, half buried beneath the winter's weight, a delicate wreath of frosted evergreens resting atop it. Elias knelt, fingers brushing away the snow as his gaze lingered on the inscription. Memories flickered her laughter, the warmth of her presence, and the cold finality of that terrible night when faith had faltered and darkness had answered. "I'm sorry it took so long," Elias whispered, placing a small bouquet of winter flowers he'd gathered from his own garden beside the stone. "I needed to understand, to forgive." The silence around him was profound, but it was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of the past, the voices of those lost, and the fragile hope of those who remained. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Gothic spires of the church cast long, somber shadows over the snow. The bell tower standing sentinel, but still and silent, its voice stilled for now. Elias rose, feeling an unexpected lightness, a sense of closure mingled with cautious optimism. The battle had scarred the town and its people, but it had also forged a new resilience. Walking back through the quiet streets, his footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness, Elias's thoughts turned to the future. The lessons of the past were clear. Faith must be guarded with vigilance. Fear must never be allowed to fester unchecked. And the echoes of history must be heard lest the bells toll again. As he passed beneath the towering arches and frost-laden eaves, a whisper of wind stirred the bell ropes, but the bells remained still. Elias paused, hand resting lightly on the cold stone of the church's wall. The silence was a promise and a warning, a fragile peace held in balance. He breathed deeply, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead, knowing that the past would always be with him, shaping the faith he now carried forward. And as the first stars pierced the velvet night, the town of Raven's Hollow settled beneath the snow, wrapped in quiet remembrance, ready to face a new dawn. The snow lay thick and undisturbed over Raven's Hollow, muffling the world into a hushed stillness that felt both comforting and ominous. The Gothic church, its spires etched starkly against the obsidian sky, loomed like a sentinel guarding secrets older than the town itself. Elias Marrow stood alone beneath the frozen eaves, his breath a pale mist dissolving into the cold night air. For the first time in many sleepless weeks, the bells did not toll. Midnight passed without a sound, and the silence was profound. His eyes drifted upward to the bell tower, where the great bronze bells hung heavy and silent, their surfaces dulled by frost. The ghostly faces that had once screamed in torment now still, locked beneath the icy sheen. The absence of their dreadful cries was a balm to the town, a promise of peace, yet in Elias's heart, a cautious unease lingered. The battle had been won, but the war against fear and darkness was far from over. He wrapped his scarf tighter, the fabric rough against his chin, and took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the night settle deep within him. Memories of Clara surfaced unbidden, the flicker of candlelight, the echo of laughter cut short, the shadow of loss that had driven him from faith to skepticism. Yet here, beneath the church's looming shadow, that skepticism had been tested and reshaped. Faith was no longer a certainty, nor was it a shield. It was a fragile thread woven through fear and hope alike. From the church's heavy oak doors came the soft glimmer of candlelight. Mara Devlin emerged, her robes trailing lightly on the snow, a quiet smile touching her lips as she caught sight of Elias. Her eyes, sharp and penetrating even in the dim glow, held a steady warmth. She approached with deliberate steps, carrying a small lantern that cast flickering shadows on the stone path. "The town breathes easier tonight," Mara said, her voice low and steady, "but we must not forget the cost. Darkness does not disappear. It only waits for a crack to slip through." Elias nodded, his gaze returning to the silent bells. "The silence feels like a second prayer," he said softly. "But I wonder if it's a quiet before the storm." Mara's smile was faint but unwavering. "Then we must be ready to answer that storm, together. Faith, like the bells, must be kept alive even if only in whispers." As they spoke, the faint crunch of footsteps approached. Jonas Pike appeared from the shadows, his broad frame outlined against the snowy street. His soot-stained hands were buried deep in the pockets of his heavy coat, eyes scanning the night with a watchful intensity. "No sign of trouble so far," Jonas said gruffly, his voice carrying a rough edge softened by relief. "But I'm not letting my guard down. Not yet." Elias clapped a hand on Jonas's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and gratitude. "Neither am I. This town has endured much, but it's stronger for it." The three stood in shared silence, the cold pressing in around them. The church's dark silhouette a reminder of the night's horrors and the hope that had sprung from them. Above, the bells remained still, their silence a fragile truce with the shadows. Inside the church, Marek knelt before the altar, lighting candles with deliberate care. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls etched with faded inscriptions and worn carvings. Her whispered prayers wove through the still air, a plea for protection, healing, and vigilance. Each flame was a small beacon against the lingering darkness, a symbol that the spirit of Raven's Hollow endured. Outside again, Elias pulled his journal from his coat pocket, the worn leather cover creaking softly as he opened it. His pen hovered over the page, fingers trembling slightly not from cold, but from the weight of memory and the uncertain future. He began to write, his words flowing steady and sure. "The bells are silent tonight. The town breathes in this moment of peace, fragile as the snowflakes that fall. Yet beneath the quiet, a warning hums, a reminder that darkness, once awakened, may never fully sleep. Faith has been tested, fear confronted, and sound turned to weapon and shield alike. We stand now at a crossroads, where belief and doubt intertwine, and the fate of Raven's Hollow rests in the balance." A sudden gust of wind swept through the streets, stirring the snow in swirling eddies. Elias shivered involuntarily, his eyes flickering toward the bell tower once more. Though silent, it seemed to watch him, the ghostly faces frozen in bronze, a silent chorus of warnings and memories. "Whatever comes," he murmured, "we will face it." Together, the church bells, though still, had spoken their final toll, for now not with screams or terror, but with a quiet that held the promise of endurance. Midnight's stillness was a fragile peace, a breath drawn between the chapters of a story still unfolding. And as Raven's Hollow settled beneath its blanket of snow, its people wrapped in cautious hope and the scars of the past, the night whispered of battles yet to come, of faith forged anew in the crucible of fear, and of the unyielding courage that would face the darkness when it returned. The midnight bell would toll again someday, but when it did, Elia's Marrow and the town of Raven's Hollow would be ready. For now, the silence was enough. The snow continued to fall, and the church stood watchful, a dark silhouette etched against the quiet sky, a monument to a night when faith and fear had clashed in deadly harmony, and a testament to the resilience that followed. The end was not an ending, but a promise,